In the waning days of an empire, when the old order was crumbling, and ambitious men were reaching for power like drowning sailors grasping for driftwood, there came a moment that would determine the fate of an entire civilization. This is the story of the Battle of Red Cliffs, one of history's most consequential naval engagements, a confrontation that saw not merely armies clash, but entire visions of China's future collide in a violent struggle for dominion. It is a tale of cunning and courage, of brilliant stratagems and desperate gambles, of how fire and water became the instruments through which history was rewritten. To understand what brought such vast forces to the shores of the Yangtze River in the year 208 of the Common Era, we must first comprehend the world that had created the conditions for such a catastrophe. The Han Dynasty, which had ruled China for centuries and brought it to heights of power and prestige, was dying. Not in the way that empires sometimes die suddenly through conquest or catastrophic military defeat, but through a slower, more agonizing process of internal decay. The imperial government, once the instrument through which a unified China maintained its stability, had become corrupt, its authority hollowed out by eunuchs and court factions more interested in their own advancement than in the welfare of the empire. The common people, crushed under the weight of taxation and burdened by the chaos of an increasingly ineffectual government, had begun to rebel. Across the empire, peasant uprisings erupted, the most significant being the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which shook the foundations of Han authority and revealed just how fragile the imperial system had become. In this vacuum of collapsing central authority, warlords began to emerge. These were powerful regional military commanders who initially claimed to be acting in the emperor's name, restoring order and protecting the imperial institution. But as the Han dynasty continued its decline, the pretense of serving the emperor grew increasingly transparent. What these warlords were actually doing was carving out kingdoms for themselves, building power bases, consolidating territory, and preparing for the inevitable moment when one of them would feel strong enough to dispense with the fiction of imperial authority altogether and seize supreme power openly. Among these warlords, three figures came to dominate the landscape of northern and central China. In the north, Cao Cao had built the most formidable military machine, a ruthlessly efficient state apparatus that turned conquered territory into the infrastructure of permanent warfare. Cao Cao was not merely a general but an administrator, a strategist, and a visionary who understood that controlling territory meant more than merely occupying it. It meant organizing that territory's resources, its people, and its productive capacity toward the ends of military expansion. To the south and east, Sun Ke and his successor Sun Quan had inherited and expanded a domain that controlled the wealthy Yangtze River region, an area rich in resources and protected by difficult terrain that made invasion from the north a daunting proposition. And in the west and center, Liu Bei represented something different from the other two. He claimed to be the true heir to the Han dynasty, a noble figure dedicated to restoring the imperial system rather than replacing it with his own rule. Yet despite this claim to moral legitimacy, Liu Bei too was consolidating power, building an army, and preparing for the struggles that he knew were coming. By the year 208, it had become clear that these three powers could not indefinitely coexist. Cao Cao, commanding the most powerful military force and controlling the richest territories in the north, had begun to move south. His armies advanced down the great river systems, conquering territory and bringing region after region under his dominion. To Cao Cao, it seemed that unification under his rule was inevitable, that the other warlords, lacking his military genius or his organizational capabilities, would eventually fall before him. His confidence was not entirely misplaced. Cao Cao had never been decisively defeated in battle. His armies were well trained and well supplied. His administrative apparatus was superior to anything his rivals had constructed. Everything in his experience suggested that the natural conclusion of these conflicts would be his triumph and his establishment of a new dynasty to replace the dying Han. Yet Cao Cao had not accounted for the possibility that his rivals, faced with the choice between certain subjugation and desperate resistance, might unite against him. And he had not fully appreciated the advantages that his opponents possessed. Advantages that would become crucial when the confrontation finally came. Liu Bei and Sun Quan, recognizing that Cao Cao's continued expansion would eventually overwhelm them both, made the decision to set aside their own conflicts and unite against the common threat. This alliance was not born from friendship or mutual affection. Liu Bei and Sun Quan had their own territorial disputes and their own ambitions that were in direct conflict with one another. But they understood the simple calculus of survival. United, they might have a chance to resist Cao Cao. Divided, they would fall one after another until Cao Cao stood supreme. And so an alliance was forged, tentative and fragile though it was, between the southern and eastern warlords against the dominant northern power. The crucial figure in this alliance was a man named Zhuge Liang, one of history's most celebrated military strategists and political minds. Zhuge Liang entered Liu Bei's service as a young man of exceptional intellect and strategic vision. He had studied the ancient texts of warfare, understood the principles of statecraft, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to see several moves ahead in the grand chess game of imperial politics. When Liu Bei sought counsel about how to respond to Cao Cao's threat, it was Zhuge Liang who provided the analysis that would shape the subsequent campaign. He explained that Cao Cao, despite his military superiority, had certain vulnerabilities. His armies, drawn primarily from the north, were unaccustomed to naval warfare. His supply lines, extending hundreds of miles, were vulnerable to disruption, and his forces, while numerous, were spread across a vast territory and not concentrated at any single point. Most importantly, Zhuge Liang understood that geography and terrain could be as important as the size of armies, and that the Yangtze River, with its treacherous currents and narrow channels, presented an opportunity for a smaller but better positioned force to resist a numerically superior enemy. Cao Cao, confident in his inevitable victory, began his advance toward the Yangtze River. His armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, a vast force that represented the culmination of years of conquest and consolidation. He had gathered together the military resources of the entire North and brought them to bear in this campaign to complete his domination of China. As his forces approached the Great River, he seemed unstoppable. Various warlords and commanders who stood in his path either fled before him or were crushed in battles where Cao Cao's superior numbers and tactics proved decisive. Liu Bei and Sun Quan's forces were numerically far inferior to Cao Cao's. Their combined armies numbered perhaps a quarter of Cao Cao's forces, a stark disadvantage in a conventional confrontation. But what they lacked in numbers, they could potentially compensate for through other advantages. Sun Quan's forces, being native to the Yangtze River region, possessed superior knowledge of the river's currents, its depths, its seasonal variations, and its geography. They understood how to operate boats and ships in ways that northern soldiers, drawn from the plains and used to cavalry and conventional land warfare, did not. And crucially, Liu Bei and Sun Quan possessed the services of Zhuge Liang, whose strategic mind would prove to be worth more than thousands of soldiers when it came time to execute the plans that would save their alliance from destruction. As Cao Cao's armies approached the Yangtze, they began to construct a massive flotilla of ships and boats. Cao Cao understood that to cross the river and pursue his enemies, he would need naval capability. He gathered together ships from conquered territories, built new vessels, and assembled what he believed would be a navy capable of establishing Cao Cao's supremacy on the water as well as on land. But here lay a critical vulnerability that Zhuge Liang had identified. These ships, cobbled together from various sources and crewed by soldiers who were primarily trained as infantry rather than as naval personnel, lacked the cohesion and the practiced coordination of forces that had been fighting together for years. The crews were not comfortable with one another. The ships had not been coordinated into a functioning fleet. The commanders of individual vessels had not practiced working together as a unified force. As these vast armies converged on the Yangtze River in the winter of 208, the stage was being set for one of history's most dramatic confrontations. Cao Cao had nearly won. His armies had conquered most of the known world. Only Liu Bei and Sun Quan stood in his way, and they seemed to many observers to be merely delaying the inevitable. Yet it was at precisely this moment, when Cao Cao seemed on the verge of total victory, that fortune and strategy would combine to produce an outcome that no one had anticipated. The two armies positioned themselves on opposite banks of the Yangtze River near a geographical feature called Red Cliffs, a dramatic landscape of red-colored rock formations that gave the eventual battle its name. Cao Cao's forces occupied the northern bank, and Liu Bei and Sun Quan's combined forces held the southern bank. For a time, the armies faced each other across the water, neither side quite ready to commit fully to battle. Cao Cao, confident in his superiority, was content to take time to integrate his naval forces and prepare for the final assault. Liu Bei and Sun Quan, aware that time was not their ally, but that desperate measures might yet turn the tide, began preparing the stratagems that Zhuge Liang had conceived. At this moment, chance provided the Southern Alliance with an unexpected advantage. A plague broke out among Cao Cao's soldiers. The crowded conditions of the military camps, the stress of the long campaign, and the unfamiliar climate of the south created conditions in which disease spread rapidly through the ranks. Soldiers who had been healthy and ready for battle suddenly found themselves weakened by illness. The fighting strength of Cao Cao's armies, already strained by the challenges of operating in unfamiliar territory, was further diminished by the invisible enemy of epidemic disease. Cao Cao, concerned about the health of his forces, made a decision that would ultimately prove to be a grave strategic error. He ordered his ships to be chained together. The reasoning behind this decision was not entirely irrational. By chaining the ships together, Cao Cao created a more stable platform that would be easier for soldiers suffering from seasickness and illness to remain aboard. The connected vessels would move as a unified whole rather than pitching and rolling individually. For soldiers unaccustomed to naval warfare and already suffering from disease, this stability was genuinely beneficial. But this decision also had a catastrophic disadvantage that Zhuge Liang had anticipated. Ships chained together could not maneuver independently. They could not scatter and disperse in response to threats. If fire were introduced to this connected mass of wooden vessels, the flames would spread from ship to ship, with no possibility of the individual vessels breaking free and escaping. It was precisely this vulnerability that Zhuge Liang planned to exploit. He conceived a stratagem so bold and so dangerous that it would require not merely military courage, but a willingness to gamble everything on a single, desperate action. Zhuge Liang proposed to Liu Bei and Sun Quan that they construct fire ships, ordinary vessels laden with straw, tar, and other combustible materials, set ablaze, and then sent downriver toward Cao Cao's chained fleet. The fire ships would drift with the current, carried by the Yangtze's powerful flow directly toward Cao Cao's anchored vessels. When they reached their target, the flames would engulf the chained ships, spreading from vessel to vessel, creating a conflagration that would destroy Cao Cao's naval capability and create chaos and terror among his forces. The plan was audacious and fraught with risk. If it succeeded, it could turn the tide of the entire campaign. If it failed, it would have accomplished nothing except the loss of the fire ships themselves, and Cao Cao would remain in a superior position. Moreover, executing the plan required precise timing and favorable conditions. The fire ships would need to be released at exactly the right moment, when the wind and current would carry them toward Cao Cao's fleet. The operation would need to be coordinated with a simultaneous land and naval assault by Liu Bei and Sun Quan's main forces, so that when Cao Cao's fleet was in chaos from the fires, the southern forces would strike with maximum force. As the southern commanders prepared for this desperate gamble, they also implemented a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. They sent a defector, or more accurately, an apparent defector, to Cao Cao's camp. This man, working in concert with Zhuge Liang's plans, carried a message to Cao Cao suggesting that the southern forces were planning to attack his fleet, and that if Cao Cao wanted to prevent this attack, he should remain vigilant and keep his forces alert. The defector also conveyed specific information about when the attack would come. This information was absolutely true. Cao Cao was indeed about to be attacked. But by providing accurate information and by framing it as coming from someone who claimed to be betraying Liu Bei and Sun Quan to Cao Cao, Zhuge Liang created a situation where Cao Cao's suspicion and alertness would not prevent the attack, because the attack was already coming exactly as predicted. On the night that Zhuge Liang had determined to be optimal for the fire ship attack, the southern forces prepared their vessels. The fire ships were loaded with combustible materials and set ablaze. As they caught fire, they were released into the current of the Yangtze River. The flames, bright in the darkness of the night, made the approaching fire ships highly visible to Cao Cao's forces. Sentries saw the burning vessels drifting downriver toward the chained fleet. Alarms were raised. Cao Cao's commanders, warned by the defector that an attack was coming but perhaps overconfident in their ability to repel it, initially believed that they could defend against the approaching threat. But the volume and intensity of the fire was far greater than anyone had anticipated. As the burning fire ships collided with Cao Cao's anchored fleet, the flames spread with terrifying speed. The tar and pitch that covered the wooden vessels ignited. The straw and other combustibles fueled an inferno that could not be extinguished. And because the ships were chained together, the fire spread from vessel to vessel, transforming the entire connected fleet into a massive bonfire that illuminated the night sky with an orange glow visible for miles in every direction. In the chaos and panic that followed, Cao Cao's naval forces dissolved into disorder. Soldiers attempted to escape the burning ships, some jumping into the river, others trying to swim to the northern bank. The organized military force that had seemed so formidable moments before fragmented into desperate individuals trying to save their own lives. The carefully constructed coordination that naval warfare required was shattered by the immediate terror of the flames and the collapsing vessels. It was at this moment, as Cao Cao's fleet was engulfed in flames and his sailors were dying in the water or fleeing in panic, that Liu Bei and Sun Quan's main forces attacked. The southern soldiers, using boats and small craft that could maneuver in ways that Cao Cao's larger chained vessels could not, attacked the flaming fleet and the surrounding Cao Cao forces. The naval superiority that Cao Cao had believed he possessed evaporated in smoke and flame. His sailors, many of whom had never been trained for combat on water and were now traumatized by the fire and the deaths of their comrades, fled or surrendered rather than continuing to fight. The destruction of Cao Cao's fleet was not merely a military defeat, but a psychological catastrophe for his forces. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Cao Cao's armies, the sense that they would inevitably triumph over any opposition, was shattered in the flames of Red Cliffs. Soldiers who had believed themselves part of an unstoppable war machine discovered that they could be defeated, that their commanders' plans could fail, that death could come not from the swords and spears of an enemy they could see, but from fire and chaos that they could not control. The destruction was not complete. Cao Cao himself escaped the immediate disaster, as did a substantial portion of his forces. But the momentum of his campaign had been broken. The fleet that he had constructed to project power down the Yangtze and pursue his enemies across the southern territories was gone. His strategy of advancing rapidly down the river to overwhelm the southern forces through superior numbers had been transformed from seeming triumph to catastrophic failure in the course of a single night. In the aftermath of the fire ship attack, Cao Cao's forces attempted to reorganize and continue their offensive. But the psychological impact of the defeat combined with the practical loss of his naval capability and the continuing plague among his soldiers, rendered continued offensive operations increasingly difficult. Cao Cao's commanders urged him to consolidate his forces and withdraw to more defensible positions in the north. The dream of immediate total victory through this southern campaign began to crumble as it became clear that the southern forces, though smaller in number, were not going to be easily swept aside. What followed the initial fireship attack was not a single decisive battle, but a series of engagements and maneuvers, as both sides attempted to press their advantages or recover from their setbacks. Cao Cao's forces attempted to establish bridgeheads across the Yangtze at various points, seeking to bring their superior numbers to bear in land warfare where they had proven advantages over their opponents. The southern forces, meanwhile, worked to prevent these crossings and to harass Cao Cao's retreating forces. The waters of the Yangtze became a zone of constant conflict, with small naval engagements and skirmishes continuing for days and weeks after the initial catastrophic fireship attack. The Battle of Red Cliffs, in this broader sense, was not a single moment, but rather a series of connected events spanning several months. But the critical turning point, the moment when the outcome of the entire conflict became clear, was unquestionably the night when the fireships reached Cao Cao's fleet and transformed the course of history. As the weeks passed, and it became increasingly clear that Cao Cao would not achieve the total victory he had anticipated, he made the decision to withdraw his forces back to the north. This was not a rout or a panicked flight, but a calculated retreat by a commander who understood that he had been checked and who was not willing to continue bleeding his army against opponents who had proven themselves capable of using strategy and deception as effectively as he could use military force. Cao Cao's withdrawal marked the end of his attempt to unify China under his sole dominion through this southern campaign. It also marked a decisive turning point in the fragmentation of China that would follow. With Cao Cao's retreat, the southern forces under Liu Bei and Sun Quan had preserved their independence and their territory. They had prevented the immediate conquest that had seemed so inevitable before Red Cliffs. Yet the alliance between Liu Bei and Sun Quan, which had been forged in the face of common danger, was not destined to endure. Within a few years of the Battle of Red Cliffs, the two warlords' relationship deteriorated. Liu Bei moved westward, establishing his power base in the region known as Shu, where he would eventually proclaim himself emperor and establish the state of Shu Han. Sun Quan remained in the south and east, where his family's domain would eventually become the state of Eastern Wu. And Cao Cao, retreating to his northern domain, would consolidate his power and eventually have his son proclaim himself emperor, establishing the state of Wei. The ultimate consequence of Red Cliffs was thus not the unification of China under a single ruler, but rather the fragmentation of the empire into three competing states: Wei in the north, Shu Han in the west and center, and Eastern Wu in the south and east. This period, known as the Three Kingdoms era, would last for decades and would be characterized by constant warfare, diplomatic maneuvering, and the slow consolidation of territory by the competing powers. Eventually, Sima Yan, a general of the Wei state, would overthrow the Wei ruling family and establish the Jin dynasty, which would reunify China, but that unification would come not immediately after Red Cliffs, but rather decades later, after the Three Kingdoms period had run its course. Yet despite this delayed unification, it was Red Cliffs that determined the shape of the entire subsequent history. Had Cao Cao succeeded in his southern campaign, had he defeated Liu Bei and Sun Quan and established his dominion over all of China, the subsequent history would have followed a very different trajectory. Cao Cao would have established a new dynasty, and the fragmentation and warfare of the Three Kingdoms period would never have occurred. The particular characters, the particular conflicts, the particular cultural and political developments that arose during the Three Kingdoms era would have been entirely different. The Battle of Red Cliffs is thus one of those rare historical moments where we can point to a specific event and say with confidence that it altered the course of history. It was a moment where smaller forces, led by a brilliant strategist, defeated a numerically superior enemy through superior planning, superior understanding of the environment, superior use of psychology and deception, and superior willingness to take a desperate gamble when the odds seemed to be entirely against them. It was a moment where fire and water became the instruments of history. The victory also belongs in large part to Zhuge Liang, who emerged from the Battle of Red Cliffs as one of history's most celebrated military strategists. Yet Zhuge Liang was not merely a strategist in the sense of planning grand campaigns. He was a political mind and a visionary who understood that the outcome of the battle was not itself the end goal. Rather, the outcome of the battle needed to serve broader political purposes. By preserving Liu Bei's independence and territory through Red Cliffs, Zhuge Liang had preserved the possibility that Liu Bei could continue to pursue his vision of restoring the Han dynasty, or at least of establishing a competing center of power that could resist Cao Cao's dominance. In the decades that followed Red Cliffs, Zhuge Liang would continue to serve Liu Bei and, after Liu Bei's death, Liu Bei's son. He would be involved in virtually every major strategic decision made by the Shu Han state. He would oversee military campaigns, administrative reforms, diplomatic negotiations, and economic policies. Yet many historians suggest that his greatest achievement was not any single campaign or policy, but rather his role in preserving the possibility of resistance to Cao Cao at the moment when such resistance seemed impossible. By demonstrating that Cao Cao could be defeated, that his armies were not invincible, Red Cliffs opened the door to the Three Kingdoms period and all the historical developments that followed from it. The fire ships themselves became legendary in Chinese military history. Generations of subsequent military commanders studied the tactics employed at Red Cliffs, seeking to understand how a smaller force could defeat a numerically superior enemy through superior strategy and superior understanding of the environment. The principle of using fire as a weapon, of exploiting vulnerability created by faulty decisions, of coordinating multiple forms of attack to overwhelm an enemy's ability to respond. These became standard elements of Chinese military theory and practice. Yet the human cost of Red Cliffs should not be forgotten in the celebration of the tactical brilliance that the battle displayed. Tens of thousands of soldiers died in the flames or drowned in the Yangtze River. Tens of thousands more died in the subsequent engagements and maneuvers that followed the initial fireship attack. The soldiers who died at Red Cliffs were not merely casualties in an abstract historical drama. They were individual human beings, with names and families, with hopes and fears, with lives that extended beyond their role as soldiers in this great conflict. They died because their commanders had determined that the struggle for power was worth the price in human blood, and they died in ways that were often terrible and terrifying. The Battle of Red Cliffs stands as a monument to the complexity of warfare, to the way that superior strategy and superior understanding can matter more than superior numbers, and to the terrible human cost of the great political transformations that reshape history. It shows us that even when an outcome seems inevitable, when one side appears to have overwhelming advantage, circumstances and human choice can still produce unexpected results. It demonstrates the power of ideas, of strategic vision, of psychological understanding, of the ability to see several moves ahead in the great game of power and conflict. The Yangtze River still flows past the location where the Battle of Red Cliffs took place over 18 centuries ago. The dramatic Red Cliffs still stand as a testament to that moment when history turned on the edge of a knife. In the minds of those who study military history, in the imagination of those who read the tales and legends of that era, the fireships still burn in the darkness of that distant night, carrying with them the dreams and ambitions and fears of hundreds of thousands of soldiers caught in one of history's great turning points. The Battle of Red Cliffs reminds us that history is not a simple matter of inevitability, that the outcome of great conflicts is not predetermined by the simple accumulation of resources and numbers, and that brilliance and courage and psychological understanding can sometimes overcome the overwhelming advantages of military superiority. It reminds us also that these victories come at a terrible price, that the fire that lights the way to new historical eras is fed by the suffering and death of those who have no choice but to face it. In remembering Red Cliffs, we are bearing witness not merely to a military triumph, but to a moment when the entire trajectory of a civilization was altered by the convergence of strategy, psychology, courage, and the desperate gambles that desperate people make when they face the prospect of annihilation and choose instead to resist.